A charm offensive in Europe by China's president. He sought to win support for his vision of a multipolar world, countering American dominance and deepening trade and investments with countries historically close to Beijing. So did Xi Jinping succeed? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. China's President Xi Jinping has wrapped up his first visit to Europe in 5 years. He visited France, Serbia and Hungary during his trip, with a different tone and agenda at each stop. But Xi's overarching goals were constant: counter US influence where he can, and further trade and investments to shore up a slowing economy. So what are the takeaways for Beijing from Xi's trip? We'll explore these and other issues with our guests in just a moment's time. But first, this report by Katia Lopez-Hodiyan.
China is looking for more friends in Europe, and Hungary is looking for investors. Strategically, it appears they found their match. On the last stop of his 5-day visit to Europe, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Viktor Orban signed several agreements in Budapest to boost their economic ties.
We'll strengthen development strategies, deepen cooperation in economy and trade, investment and finance. We'll push forward the construction of key projects, such as the Budapest-Belgrade Railway.
This construction site in eastern Hungary reflects that partnership. An $8 billion Chinese factory that will produce lithium for electric vehicle batteries. Chinese batteries for Chinese cars to be sold inside the European Union.
We used to live in a one-centre world order, but now we live in a multi-centre world. And one of the pillars of this new world order is the Republic of China, which now defines the course of world and economic politics.
Most recently, both countries have faced resistance from the European Union, with their support of Russia's war in Ukraine fueling those tensions. Amid its strained relationship with the West, some say China is using Hungary as a bridge to tap into the European market. China's push to strengthen ties with Eastern European countries includes Serbia. It's set to become the first European country in years to enter a free trade agreement with Beijing in July. Xi's visit is seen as a sign of defiance to the West, NATO, and the European Union. Some in Serbia are concerned about the partnership.
I generally think that from foreign investors in Serbia, this country cannot profit at all. Most of them are looking to extract profit, and Chinese companies are not any different.
Much of Western Europe remains skeptical. Despite a bid to warm ties with France, there were reportedly no major concessions on trade or foreign policy during Xi's meeting with President Emmanuel Macron. Access to European markets and the war in Ukraine remain sticking points.
Our immemorial friendship only has meaning if it lends a helping hand to all of humanity in all of the torments which it faces, climatic as well as geopolitical.
Despite tensions with the West, China wants to solidify its economic footprint in Europe through new partnerships. But it's unclear in the long run whether such ties will help or hurt its new partners. Katia Lopez-Hodiyan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guest from Beijing, David Mahon, the founder and chairman of Mahon China. He advises multinationals on their China strategy and expansion. Steve Tsang directs the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. Today, he's joining us from Nottingham in the UK, and from Belgrade, Nenad Stekic, a research fellow with the think tank, the Institute of International Politics and Economics. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Welcome to Inside Story. David, I wonder if I can start with you. In recent years, Europe's relationship with China has come to be known as a, quote, rival competitor partner relationship. It seems like a contradiction in terms. What do we mean by it?
I think it is a contradiction in terms. Europe, individual countries and companies want to trade with China, but have come under tremendous pressure from the US to restrain themselves in doing so. And because of the need for support in fighting or supporting the Ukrainian army against the Russian invasion, America's leverage is much greater in Europe. So Xi's trip is important because he needs to try and recover a relationship that has begun to atrophy under US pressure.
Nenad, do you agree with that? Can you be both partners and rivals?
Definitely, yes. We have witnessed the statement of President Xi that European Union is going to take, I think, the most important part of contemporary China's security, not only security, but foreign policy as well. So definitely China and European Union could be both partners and rivals, depending on what kind of area of social life are we referring to. If you observe, for instance, security phenomena that are occurring in the Middle East or in Ukraine, I definitely believe that there are some avenues in which both sides can cooperate in the future, of course.
Steve, I wonder if we can start with President Xi's presence in France, because President Emmanuel Macron made no secret of the fact that he wants France to deepen its political and economic ties with China. Is that sentiment truly reciprocated, though, by Beijing?
Well, it is something that Beijing very much appreciates. And in fact, the Chinese foreign policy approach has always been guided by what they call the United Front approach. The United Front is just about the world's most sophisticated divide and rule approach ever. When Germany was under Angela Merkel, China's preferred partner was always Germany within the European Union. But with the change in government in Germany, France under President Macron has become the most China-friendly of the big EU member states. And that's why they have turned their focus on working with France, because France is more receptive to the Chinese approach. And the choice of the three locations, three countries for visit, very much reflects what Xi Jinping feels comfortable with.
What Steve has hinted at very closely is that he believes that lurking behind all of this is very much a divide and conquer policy. Is that a cynical way of looking at China's presence in Europe recently?
Well, that's Steve's perspective, and I respect very much Steve's knowledge of China. I'd say from someone who, I live in Beijing, I've been here for the last 40 years, that sense of the United Front, or even that China has the leverage that it once perhaps imagined it has, isn't so strong. I think the issues here are very economic. One of the things that China really wants to make sure of is that its largest trading partner, Europe, remains so. The compatibility between the European countries' economies and China's is very good. It remains, and there's tremendous growth potential for that. Whereas the American relationship, one is fought deeply by the geopolitical tensions, and you kind of know you're on a path to war of sorts when geopolitics becomes the greater driver rather than economics. Whereas I think in Europe, it's still an economic issue. And when we look at situations that China's assessing, such as building vehicle plants in countries like Hungary, here's an opportunity for China to add some value, not just use a platform in Europe or cheap labor, but actually transfer technology, form real partnerships. So the challenge for China is to do things a different way. And I think they are considering to do that. They have a need to, because they're being very much contained these days.
Nenad, just following on from what we've just heard there, given all the value that China can potentially bring to Europe, just to remind our viewers, around the table there in Paris wasn't just Emmanuel Macron, there was also Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission. She was there sending the common EU message. But how united is the EU when it comes to China?
I definitely would not subscribe to the stance that China intends to divide and conquer Europe, or especially European Union. On the contrary, this trilateral meeting that Xi Jinping has held with Macron and also Ursula von der Leyen, and also please do not forget that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in visit to Beijing a few weeks ago also. And then prior to these visits to France, Olaf Scholz and Macron have gathered together to unify, to solidify their stances towards the China. So I think that actually European Union is really trying to speak with one single voice against in its policy towards China, and China really respects this kind of cooperation between Paris and Berlin, I would also say. So this is why, definitely, to my stance, is why China believes that the European Union is going to take indeed the top of the agenda of its foreign policy in the near future.
Yeah, interesting that you bring up the absence of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. I wonder what that says about the sensitivity surrounding the EU and China relations at the moment. David, I wonder how the reported rise in cases of China spying on European states, the human rights record in China, the treatment of the minority Muslim Uyghurs in China, how all of these issues complicate the desire among some European states to forge deeper relations with China.
They certainly make it more difficult. All countries spy on everyone all the time. If we remember years ago, Barack Obama landing in Berlin, and there was a revelation that Angela Merkel's phone had been hacked by his security people. So it seems that there are strategic releases of information around such visits. I wouldn't put too much store by them. And on the human rights front, I'm a frequent visitor to Xinjiang. There are problems there, particularly in the south around Hetian. But in general, Xinjiang is nothing like it is described in America and Europe. So I think these are issues. There are issues of imbalances in China. There's issues of press freedom. We don't have an Al Jazeera here. There are many things which one can criticize about China. But let's come down to fundamental need and motive. I think here we are looking at the European Union that needs economic growth. It needs links. And also, China has tremendous needs to capitalize on the recovery post-COVID that it's now enjoying. Right. And everyone wants the war in Ukraine to end, China too. And I agree that there is some possibility there that working with Europe, there may be an earlier end to that or a ceasefire.
All right, gentlemen, let's pause for a second because I want to share some more information with our viewers, because some analysts say President Xi used his European visit to woo Europe while exploiting its divisions. With Serbia a candidate for joining the EU, but not a member, he was able to sign a free trade deal with Xi. But President Alexander Vučić also went further, saying Belgrade was also signed up to a, quote, shared future with Beijing and its vision of a new world order. In Budapest, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has long been at odds with fellow EU leaders over major policies, even telling them they've failed and should leave. The Chinese president sought to win him over with pledges of investments in energy and transport. And Xi Jinping promised to move forward on a $2.1 billion project to connect the capitals of both countries as part of China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. Steve, returning to you, is China trying to draw a wedge between European states?
The Chinese didn't understand the EU 25 years ago. They understand the EU extremely well now. And that's exactly why they put so much emphasis on cultivating the relationship with Hungary, because they know they only need one powerful ally within the European Union, and then it can block a lot of what the European Union may otherwise want to do under the leadership of von der Leyen in how it engages with China. So I think there is certainly an intention for Xi Jinping in this visit to befriend Europeans and win over European opinions. But he is doing it with a very Sino-centric approach, which means that apart from the countries that he is visiting, Hungary, Serbia, and to a lesser extent France, is not actually winning over the public opinion within the European Union.
Right, let's look Steve, I would like to, Steve, yes, exactly. I would like to drill into this Sino-centric approach that you've referred to. You say that if he really wanted to bridge the divide and send a a joined-up message? He'd be visiting Brussels, the heart of the European Union, as opposed to selectively choosing his countries like this. Talking about those countries that he selected to visit, let's talk about Hungary in a minute, but let's focus on Serbia now. As I mentioned there earlier, it's not an EU member. It's traditionally always been close to Russia. President Xi was there marking 25 years since NATO bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, something Washington says was a mistake. Nenad, what does this visit say to you? It seems laden with symbolism.
Of course, yeah. It is actually just being placed 25 years after the Chinese embassy in Belgrade has been hit by the NATO missiles. This is correct. And despite all the allegations, Chinese side probably will never, I would say, believe this claim that it was unintended strike. I would say that definitely 25 years ago, this kind of attack has caused outrage in China, not only within the Chinese leadership and Chinese president at that time, who was Jiang Zemin, but also on the streets. We have witnessed massive protests against the political West. And I believe that actually what makes closer the two countries, Serbia and China, is definitely this kind of anti-Western political sentiment that has been arising within that actually ever since of the bombing time. So yes, 25th anniversary of the embassy hit was definitely indeed huge symbolism. And even here within the domestic public today, many people are actually referring to this as a very important connecting tie between the two nations.
David Mahon, shared anti-Western sentiment shared between Serbia and China. I understand you visited the site of that bombed embassy soon afterwards. How do you read this?
Well, my impression was that, one, it was at the edge of town. There was no sense, how could this be a mistake? I do remember the Ministry of Defence, where missiles had turned street corners and gone straight into the Ministry of Defence in Belgrade very surgically. So I don't believe for a moment it was a mistake. But China was weak at the time. America read that and knew that it could do something like this and send a message. So it's a complex situation. In the end, I don't think that there is a sophisticated plan to split Europe. China is currently playing to its strengths where it can. And these are relationships where China believes it can get some economic gains and get a firmer position in some countries in Europe, rather than deal with the more conflicted internal politics around China that Germany faces. Nonetheless, I think it was a mistake of Xi not to go to Brussels. I think he should have gone to Berlin, perhaps to London. That would have shown a confidence and a kind of broad sense of Europe. Now, I don't know what advice he was given, but to me, that was a pity. Nonetheless, I wouldn't read too much into the splitting Europe scenario. I don't think China's vain enough to think it can do that. But they do go where they feel they will be welcome, where they can announce concrete projects in real economic terms. And I think that has been one of the main drivers of this visit.
Steve, let's talk about precisely real economic terms, because China, as we know, has been investing huge sums of money into Serbia, massive infrastructure projects. I've been to several myself with Al Jazeera, huge bridges opened by Beijing with great fanfare in the country. Serbia's President Alexander Vučić calls the relationship an ironclad friendship. What's behind it, do you think?
Well, China does need friends in Europe. And for by European standards, relatively small country like Serbia, it is easier for China to make a huge impact than if China were investing in one of the larger member states of the European Union, where they have much bigger economies, and therefore the same level of Chinese investment simply would not have been seen as so significant a scale. So they are actually very, very smart. And I think we have to recognize that Xi Jinping sees himself as a transformational leader with enormous ambitions for China. He knows what he is doing. He is not stupid at all. He is a very smart
Right. Well, let me jump in there. Let me jump in there, Steve, because as you say, he's a smart operator. He knows what he's doing. Nenad, why then would you go to Hungary, the so-called bad boy of the European Union, probably one of the most disruptive states as part of the 27-member bloc, criticised by Brussels multiple times for the erosion of law, for not playing ball. If China wanted to exploit EU divisions, you go to Budapest, right?
Well, this is at the first glance this could be correct, but please do not forget that we are currently witnessing over the last 5 years a dose of the so-called Sino-skepticism, or the skepticism towards cooperating with China in general from all Central and Eastern European countries. There is the sub-initiative 17+1, which, according to my opinion, unfortunately, is currently dissolving because a few years ago we saw some Baltic states, Lithuania in 2021, has decided to withdraw from this initiative. And also it was followed by Latvia and Estonia as well. And then in Poland, we also have some kind of, I would say definitely anti-Chinese sentiment. So I think that actually Budapest is seen from Beijing's side as the partner in Central and Eastern Europe, which is the EU member state at the same time, which Serbia is not. So Serbia is the EU aspiring member state. So I believe that actually great cooperation ties that Xi has made with Hungary are the message towards both European Union and all the countries in Europe that actually China intends to solidify its presence here in Central and Eastern Europe. And also, please do not forget that actually China has promised to build a huge factory of EVs, of electric vehicles, in the southern city of Szeged in Hungary, which will be fully free to export to the Western European markets, which if this factory was based in Serbia would not be the case, would not be possible, because, you know, it would be harder from non-EU member states to export this kind of vehicles. So I believe actually that these two visits, these two state visits for Budapest and Belgrade were also interlinked. Please do not forget that the very first trans-border infrastructural project within the Belt and Road Initiative has been built exactly here between the Belgrade and Budapest high-speed railway, the very first one actually in the Balkans, if I may say so. So this is very important. You know, it can contribute to public image, the positive image in both Hungarian and Serbian public sides. Okay,
look, gentlemen, as we approach the end of this conversation, we can't really talk about China-European relations without talking about the kind of pressure the likes of Emmanuel Macron, other EU leaders hope that China will be able to put on Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Is France or other EU nations overestimating how much help China might be able to offer when it comes to Ukraine? David?
I think so. China doesn't broker deals, for instance, as the Americans have in the past. The initial accord at Camp David, when you had Yasser Arafat, and there was a peace deal sorted out. The Americans are very active in that way, as Europeans are. The Chinese facilitate, but they don't involve themselves in the discussions in the same way. That said, the war in Ukraine is bad for everybody, and whatever China may face the world with in saying they support Russia, internally they want this to end as soon as possible. So we may see something a little more active, but we can't see China in a Western sense, that they are trying to be brokers in an active way. They tend to be facilitators, and that the parties, as Saudi Arabia and Iran did recently, come together and reach their own agreement, facilitated by China.
Facilitate, but don't get involved, says David. Steve, what do you make of that?
If there is any world leader who can deliver a subtle diplomacy between Moscow and Kyiv, it is Xi Jinping. He's chosen not to do that. If there is a world leader that Putin has to listen to, it is China. China sustains the Russian war economy. So if Xi Jinping really wants to put pressure on that, he can. I'm not saying that Putin will necessarily do exactly what Xi Jinping asked him to do, but we're not seeing Xi Jinping even attempting to do that. Instead, Xi Jinping takes a consistently inconsistent policy towards the Ukraine war, which is one of declaring neutrality, supporting Putin, and refusing to pay any price for it. And that's why China is not providing weapon systems to Russia, because that will automatically trigger sanctions, therefore a price for China to pay. But anything short of that, China is doing to help the Russians to sustain the war effort. It's not a non-partisan approach. China takes a side.
Nenad, let me throw that to you. Do you think that European leaders are being a little bit too hopeful about how they may encourage Beijing to get more directly politically involved in solving conflicts in Eastern Europe? It is, of course, the 60th anniversary of French-Chinese diplomatic relations. Ukraine, as we know, has become a meat grinder. What incentive can Europe offer, if at all, to get China more involved?
Well, yes, I believe actually that Ukrainian crisis has promoted and I would say revealed new China role in global mediation issues. Because if you remember this, the recent 12-point plan issued by official Beijing for resolution or for settling the situation in Ukraine, we could notice this kind of mediation efforts that actually are aiming to promote China as a global actor capable of resolving the global security issues. And in relation to European Union and Russia as two main stakes and two main poles, I would say, in international arena currently in regards to the Ukrainian crisis, I think actually that European Union leaders should rely more on China to convince Vladimir Putin to stop this kind of war. I would also agree with what my previous interlocutor said, that actually the only person, the only capable leader nowadays that is accepted by both Ukraine, European Union, and also Russian Federation could be definitely Xi Jinping. So this is the political capital that I believe both sides should accept as a new reality and try to enlarge their strategies towards China then.
Nenad, thanks for that. We've got about a minute left. David, if I can give you the last word, seeing as you are over there in Beijing. I want to know about the Chinese audience. What message will the Chinese president give to the Chinese population on returning there to the country?
Well, the reporting is already very favourable, and that is the nature of the Chinese media here. People who want to find out another angle can turn on their VPNs and they can watch Al Jazeera, they can read France 24, they can look at various reports around the world. But in general, it is already being presented as a successful trip. So it will be cast that way when he returns. I think the thing is, the idea that there's a willful support of Russia in the war in Ukraine is wrong. Most of the world hasn't gone along with the sanctions that America's imposed. India is amongst those. China's just trading as usual, and there's been an increase, of course. But the idea of militarily supporting the war here, that is not the case. This is in everyone's worst interests.
So China across the board is charting its own course. David Mahon, Steve Tsang, Nenad Stekic, it's been a pleasure to have you on Inside Story. Many thanks for your time, gentlemen. And of course, thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Neave Barker, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.